Hi, and welcome to the Nitpicks podcast. I'm Stacey Winklepleck. I'm the Content IP and Outreach Director. And I'm here, as always, with my friend Lee.
Hello, I'm Lee. I'm the Nitpicks Books and Patterns graphic designer.
How have you been?
Pretty good.
I feel like it's been forever since I've seen you. It's only been a week.
I finally finished my game day from last summer's knit-along. My game day cardigan by Donna Eston, which we all did a knit-along last summer, and I got up to the sleeves, and then I put it on hold, and then I added patch pockets, and I finished the patch pockets on Saturday and sewed them on Sunday, and then I immediately wore it out for a hike on Sunday afternoon, and I ran into a crafty-eyed person who stopped me on the trail and was like, I have to look at your cardigan. And then
awesome.
I gave her my Instagram handle because she was like, I want to see what else you make. Like, awesome. Yay. Okay. I feel like I got a good review right out the door. So the patch pockets turned out kind of ridiculous, but because they're like them. Super rainbow. Yeah, I love them too. It's funny. It was like a very like classic kind of cardigan, and then I added these bright rainbow patch pockets, which made it less classic and more me.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to see the pockets before they were like sewn on, so
yeah,
I am excited to see the real cardigan in person because I haven't got to see it yet.
Yeah, we'll wear it next week. Yeah, and I did end up doing one of each of the block patterns from that traditional block.
The Afghan?
Well, the name of the book is Block Party, but the name of the Afghan is like Traditions Afghan or something. We'll put all the links in the show notes so you can find everything and the photo and stuff. But yeah, that Afghan is made up of 2 different block patterns, and I used one of each, so they're the same yarn but different patterns, so they're kind of
they're really fun.
Yeah, worked out well, I think. What have you been up to?
Yeah, like when it comes to like yarn crafts, not as much. I'm working on a crochet project that I'm sure we'll talk about in a later episode, and I keep buying patterns. For stuff, and I need to cast on. I bought 2 hat patterns. And I think we discussed this on here about having patterns with not the right yarn. Well, I bought 2 DK weight patterns and not really any DK weight yarn to use for it. So I think I'm a whole double. But I got Wool and Pine's Deep Winter Hat and Claire Slade's Stardrift Hat. And they're both, nice, as per usual for me, nice cable-y hat patterns. But bought them not realizing they were both in DK weight, and I didn't really have anything to use them. So
an excuse to get more yarn.
Yeah, because that's what I need is more yarn. But yeah, no, I did some sewing over the weekend. I finally sewed like a project up. It's the Blackwood cardigan by Helen's Closet. I've made it a bunch of times, and I just really wanted a nice, cozy, springy cardigan, which the weather isn't cooperating with, but I have hope.
Soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've also been up to some other things.
Yeah. Speaking of hat patterns, I released another with Nitpicks, another free Felici, and this one's Felici and Static hat pattern. Actually, I mentioned it last podcast and said, I can't talk about it yet. And then we ended up releasing it a few days before the podcast went up. So I could have talked about it then. But so a couple weeks ago, I released a pattern called Spumoni Hat, which the name was thought of by producer Andi, which I thought was a perfect fit because it looks like kind of layers of ice cream, depending on what colors you use. But it's designed for self-striping sock yarn. So you can use Felici, you can use Static. If you have other self-striping sock yarn in your stash, that's what it's meant for. And you can also do it with like leftover scraps if you have like very small balls, or like make your own stripes if you wanted to. So
yeah, which I do have a lot of those from leftover from socks. So
yeah, if you look at pictures of the pattern, you can see how you can kind of do whatever you want with stripes. It's made in 4 quadrants, and they're all knit flat, and they're connected modularly, which means no seaming. When you're done, it's done basically. It's really fun to knit because you're knitting a quarter of a hat at a time. So each quarter like goes pretty quickly. and you start at the top down for each one. So you start out with just a few stitches, and you get wider and wider, and then the cool thing too, what I think is cool because it fits the way I think about design is, if you use any other gauge other than the given gauge, the only thing that would change is your stitch count across, and the rest of the pattern is worked identical to how it's written, which means it's really easy modification to use other
Nice.
weight yarns, which I did include in the pattern. There's a bonus modification. So if you have, worsted weight self-striping or any weight at all self-striping, you can easily modify the pattern to that gauge. Especially if you're using like leftovers, so you already have a project, so you already know your gauge because it's a stockinette gauge. So if you have another project, you can just measure the gauge on. You don't have to knit a gauge swatch. So yeah, I used to design a lot of like modular any gauge patterns. So this one felt really like kind of going back to my roots, what I'm used to, what I enjoy, like how my brain works.
I was gonna exactly interject that because that is what I have. Many Lee Meredith patterns that I have purchased over the years, and it's because they're in for any weight. So
yeah.
That's fantastic. Cool. I'm so excited. I think the not funniest thing, but like one of the best things is that I had like 3 different knitters before the prototype came out, like saying how much they wanted to knit the project. Like the tech editor wanted to knit it, our coworkers wanted to knit it, and I think everyone's in the hat. So maybe that'll be our next knit along your hat, and everyone can join.
That would be a nice change from all the sweater knit alongs that I'm always trying to sit behind. I can knit a hat quickly. Yeah.
I know. I think the funniest was Elena because she has so much Felici that she's gathered over the years, which I will say I do as well. About knitting some more hats than that. So
I should mention too, it's not held double the way my other Felici pattern. It's held single, and it only uses one ball unless you make the largest size, but it's in 4 sizes. So the largest size is like very large. So if you're making any of the kind of standard sizes, one single skein project. So it's great for stash busting.
And you're modeling
we did the sample
in
static too, which static works really fun too. It's more because static stripes are like wider than Felici stripes, so it makes more like color blocks, like big rectangles of color kind of, which is cool. Yeah, and I did model the pattern.
Yeah.
we were in a rush to get it out, so we didn't want to wait for a model.
Well, we had the perfect model already. You knew exactly how to wear it. I didn't have to do anything, so.
Speaking of patterns and other, not by me and not modeled by me, we have another mini collection. If you listened to our podcast last week, we talked about how we're doing 3 mini collections. This we call it cycle internally, but this kind of like launch period. Like we released a bunch of stuff on February 15th, a bunch of yarn
all the new
we
yarn
talked about last time. Yeah. And then we released one little mini collection that day, and then we waited 2 weeks until today, the day this podcast comes out, to release the next little mini collection. Do you want to talk about that, Stacey?
Yeah, this one's called Lounge Act. This is kind of like Happy Hours was the first one, and it was kind of like going out and about, getting out. This is kind of one, kind of chill at home. Like, I don't know, I had like a picture of listening to jazz and drinking tea or wine and just kind of chilling out in the spring, on a spring Sunday afternoon. So we went with Lounge Act. And yeah, the patterns are really cool, really loose, kind of a couple of tunics. All of them are very lightweight. I think they're great ones.
They're
my favorite one.
Kind of simple lace patterns. Like not like lace shawl lace, but like more of a dense like garment lace. And they're like really small charts, which means like easy to memorize repeats, which is nice. Loungy kind of knitting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and then one of the projects, the Sea Waves top, is in our new yarn, Voliere, that was just released on February 15th. Is another example of Voliere in kind of a loose, drapey project. It is by Vera Marcoux. And I love this one.
I love that one. It's knit in a really inventive way. It's knit flat, starting at the front bottom and then up, and then the sleeves are cast on, so they're knit sideways. So the whole thing is knit in one piece that is folded over, like with a neck hole in the middle, and then it's folded over and seamed. It looks like it would be really fun to knit. and like the schematic was like, ooh, cool.
Yeah, I know. I remember when we first got the pattern in before I even got it knit up. I'm like, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, and it's so cool. It's just a really lovely, and I think Voliere was a good fit for it.
Mhm.
It's just so light. It's just like going to
Yeah,
be
so
one of those pieces
drapey.
you just kind of just lay on. I don't know. I just love that.
Yeah,
That's
I
like
could
my
definitely
favorite.
see myself wearing something like that all the time. It's comfy.
Yeah, and then there's a couple other great patterns in there. Trellis Tea by Yura Kim is
Mhm.
great. That's in Capretta.
It's, asymmetrical, which I always love. It has the
Yes.
lace kinda starting in a corner and then, like, working its way up diagonally across the body. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's a really lovely piece and very soft. I don't know, just everything I was going with soft colors and all of that, and
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, all 5 of them are great, so it's just like a
Nice.
small little collection to pick up if you especially if you love just, like, lounging at home, so we had a fun photo shoot. We had this tiny apartment over in, Southeast Portland that was very bright and colorful and kinda had a really cool, fun vibe to it that was I don't know. It was very
Lots of
inspiring being there.
plants,
Lots of plants,
gold
lots of
curtains, chandelier like, fun, like, vintagey chandeliers.
yeah, it was,
Yeah.
like, very vintagey,
Yeah.
colorful, and it was very tiny. It was just a studio, but, um, I think
But you couldn't
the
tell from the photos because I wasn't
yeah.
there, and from the
Yeah.
photos, it looks like several different rooms.
Well, there's 2 rooms, but yeah, it was very tiny, but it was great. It was well worth it. I really wanna do more shoots there. It was really fun.
Cool.
Yep, and yeah, and then, like, it's in, like, the Hawthorne if you're familiar with Portland, it's in the Hawthorne neighborhood, so it's kinda got we did some, shots outside too, and it's, like, just a bright, colorful area of Portland that was a lot of fun to go there, so I can't wait to shoot more stuff there. I think we have some more upcoming releases that can be shot there, and I have noodling around in my idea, noodling around just trying to figure out where we should shoot some of these things, so, yeah. This is what I
Cool.
think about all the time. Walking around, "Hey, I think this would be a good place to shoot," and then letting, Hillary, our creative director, and John, our photographer, know, and they're like, "No, that's not gonna work." I'm like, "Oh, all right, I guess not."
Aw. Well, that
That's
one
all right.
worked out great, so
Yeah, so I think next, we're gonna invite our silent partner, Andy, to join us, and we're gonna talk about mending for Mending March. And we're back. So Andy has come out from behind the scenes and is going to join us to talk about mending. When I say we talk about mending, it's going to be mainly Lee and Andy talking about mending because I'm the dum-dum and I'm just going to ask questions about mending because my mending skills are very nil. So go on. Teach me your ways.
Well, I'm happy to talk about mending all day long because I don't do as much as I want. I have a mending pile that's probably bigger than everything I've actually mended in my house. But I always have plans and I love doing it, and I love even more the idea of it and the reasons behind it, and the just the way people who have never done anything crafty before think that if a piece of clothing, has a hole, then it gets thrown in the garbage kind of. And a lot of people I've kind of introduced to the concept of mending is like, oh, like I don't have to have a lot of pre-existing skills. I don't have to have a machine. I don't have to have any fancy tools. Like I could give my clothes new life and keep wearing them. I don't have to throw them in the garbage. I can keep wearing them. Clothes that
And
fit well and that I love. And it's great. It's like enlightening when people realize that.
oh, and to be clear, I don't actually throw away my clothes.
Yeah.
I do quote
I
unquote
hope not.
mend them. They're just not very it's just not very well done. So I do mend when I have holes in my socks or in sweaters.
I didn't
do
mean
mend
to
them.
accuse you of throwing away clothes.
No, I just wanted to
some people do
clarify.
that. It's a
I wanted to
heartbreaking
clarify
thing
for
that happens in the
myself.
world that I wish didn't
Yes.
happen. But I love like you obviously are a crafty person who knows that mending is an option, but people who didn't grow up doing crafts, like, don't think of it as something they can do. And when they realize it is something they can do, or that a friend can do for them or something, like, they're, yeah, it's cool to know that, like, there's another option besides getting rid of something.
Andi here, and Lee and I have very different sort of philosophies on mending because there are so many different styles to do it. And I think visible mending has had a real movement, and like that's definitely the easier way to start with it and approachable. But I think it's become so dominant that people maybe don't know at this point that you don't have to do visible mending. You can make it invisible, because if you don't have that kind of eclectic style, it doesn't always fit. So some people, I think, would like to mend things, but don't think it's going to like fit in their wardrobe anymore after they do their mending. But it can, if you can find the scrap yarn. That's the hardest part, I think, about invisible mending is finding the yarn.
Yeah. If we're talking yarn, if we're talking knits, pretty much anything that's wrong can be done invisibly. And especially if you are a knitter, you understand how knit fabric works, then that's a whole different ballgame than someone who has no crafty background and it's a store-bought clothing item. And but which a lot of things still can be done invisibly, especially a ripped seam, obviously. Buttons, things that happen all the time to clothes. There's some kinds of rips that would be very difficult to do invisibly, but they can be done more subtly. Like, ripped jeans that need like actual patching. Like, it can be done in a subtle way that's not going to destroy the look of the item. If you're not into that visible mending look, which I am into personally.
Yeah, I actually,
if you're not,
just did an invisible mend on a pair of jeans, and much like with a invisible mend on a hand knit, the biggest challenge is color matching.
Yep.
If you can find a piece of fabric and the right thread, you could get very subtle with like your mend. So you like, someone has to point it out to you, but color matching is definitely the hardest part there. But with knits, it's a lot easier to color match, especially like Knit Picks yarn, where we've had a ton of the colors for so long that you could just pick up a new ball and like it'll be a different dye lot, but the color will be close enough. It doesn't even matter. Even if you had leftovers from the same dye lot for a repair, like a sweater that's been worn so much that you have a hole in it is gonna have faded differently, and like getting the exact color is never gonna happen, even if you have the yarn. Unless you can pull it from a seam. Sometimes I've if you weave in long ends and your hole is only like one snip stitch, I have eked out repairs with yarn stolen from elsewhere on the sweater.
I've done that.
Clever.
I've done that because I am the queen of dropping stitches and not realizing I've dropped a stitch, and until after I've cast off, and then I've cast off, but I have a drop stitch like 15 rows before, so I use the end of my tail to fix it. So not invisibly. I was saying earlier when we were talking about mending, I was saying I long to have invisible mending, but it's always visible mending. So, but not in a cute
and
way.
That's what I love about intentionally visible mending is you're not trying to make it look like anything specific. So however it ends up looking is exactly how you meant for it to look, because if it's visible and it's meant to look like a mend, however it looks is how it looks, and you didn't mess it up as long as it functions. But do we want to talk about like mending knits versus mending woven, or like the way that you mend knits invisibly versus the way that I mend knits, which is different?
Yeah, I've like no method for mending wovens. It's just like whatever vibes I'm feeling.
Well, let's talk about knits then.
Yeah. But knits, I do have structure and technique to that.
So if like you're talking about really small holes, if it's like a single stitch, you're basically creating the knit stitch like with a yarn needle.
Yeah, and that's how I do all of my mends actually. So I am an elbow destroyer, so I think, except for the rare like snagged and sliced stitch that needs repairing, like if I got it caught in a belt or something, almost every single mending project I've had has been an elbow I wore through. I don't know what I do to elbows, but like I think like 80% of my sweaters have mended elbows at this point.
Wow.
It's so funny. I don't think I've ever had like an elbow go out.
Yeah, I don't know.
Mine's usually snag stitches, to be honest. So.
I don't understand what I do, but I destroy them. But I don't want elbow patches on everything. I do have some sweaters with elbow patches, which is like a visible mending technique that feels
it's a design
like,
feature.
it feels like a design feature. So that appeals to me. So definitely do the elbow patches. And those are a valid mending choice. Like you don't have to do a yarn mend to mend a sweater. But for holes, I use Swiss darning, or if I can catch them early, I just duplicate stitch. Swiss darning is a mending technique that is closely related to duplicate stitch and features duplicate stitch. So you'll kind of mark out a square around your hole, and you will add these anchor stitches that run from the bottom of the hole to the last real stitch at the top of the hole to like keep things from laddering and moving around as you work. And then you duplicate stitch across the neighboring stitches next to your hole to like secure your working yarn. And then you duplicate stitch around your anchor. So you just have these like weird floating stitches you made that aren't attached to anything. And
like the stitches that would be around your needle, but you don't have a needle.
And they're not around other stitches because there's a hole, but you have some anchors to like help you. And so things don't ladder back down. And you just kind of work back and forth in rows of duplicate stitch to close up the hole. But it is a bit of a nightmare on really worn yarn because it's hard to see the stitch, even if you've got those anchor stitches in there. When like stitches get worn and felted, you just kind of have to like follow your gut. I always over stitch to make sure everything gets trapped, and that's what kind of prevents it from being like totally invisible, because like sometimes you can't tell where a stitch starts or not, so you just sort of like, I will treat that like 2 stitches, it's fine. But that's the method I use for almost everything because it's very subtle, and mending lace is a nightmare, but you can kind of use Swiss darning with eyelet stitch patterns with some decent results. It's definitely
it's definitely one you want to use for like those heirloom knits, I assume.
Or just like if you're like, no one's gonna look super close at my elbow, it's fine. And you just need like some eyelets in there. You can kind of create them by skipping sections when you do your Swiss darning. So like that's why that one's my favorite, is because it is the closest I can get to invisible. Really worn sweaters tend to be a little bit felted on the elbow, at least they are. And like you can just like felt down your mending and then it disappears.
Yeah, just kind of blends.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about that because that's how I normally. So you have a sweater elbow issue. I have a sock heel issue. I wear out holes in the heels of all my socks. Not so much hand knit socks, mostly just store bought socks. Because my hand knit socks I wear less because they're like my fancy special socks. But I normally mend darn and as opposed to. Sorry, what was it? Swiss?
It's Swiss darning, but it's basically fancy duplicate stitch.
Yeah, so that's like you're creating actual knit stitches, whereas darning is you're weaving. You're creating a woven fabric patch, basically, on top of your hole. You're just covering the hole with a woven fabric. And so that I love using a darning loom just because it's faster and easier to be neater. But you can also use a darning mushroom or darning egg or an embroidery hoop or like a squash some people use, or some people use a potato. Basically, a darning mushroom or darning egg is like a slightly rounded piece of wood. It's hard, and it's just a flat, hard rounded thing to put behind where you're working. So you can use kind of any slightly rounded hard thing, which might be some kind of ball that you have in your house, or a piece of food like a squash. Yeah, lots of things can be used. Embroidery hoops are good too. But yeah, I have a darning mushroom that I like a lot, but a darning loom just makes it a little bit easier. It just adds some extra equipment so you're not having to do all of it by hand, kind of. It makes it more like you're weaving on a loom as opposed to just weaving freehand. But either way, whatever tool you use, you're basically creating up and down yarn, which I believe if you're weaving would be the warp, I want to say, but I'm not a weaver.
None of us are weavers. We will not get those terms right.
I apologize if that's wrong, but you're creating one direction of yarn across your hole. You're covering your entire hole with yarn. You're picking up a little stitch at the top and a little stitch at the bottom, and then going up, down, up, down, up, down, little stitch on each side, right? And then you go the other way and you weave. So you go across side to side, pick up a little stitch on one side, weave up and down across all the yarn to the other side, pick up a little stitch on the other side, weave, up, up, like how weaving works. Like you're going up over the one that you last time went down under, right? I hope I'm explaining this well enough. Also, I think in the show notes we should link to
some tutorials.
Whatever tutorials we find. We don't have a lot of tutorial content on our website, so we will link to outside tutorial content so that you can have some kind of visual to what we're saying. But yeah, the basic idea is you're weaving and you're stitching all around in the process of while you're weaving, so that you're creating a woven patch that is stitched on to your fabric around the hole. So the hole is covered. And I love using like multicolored hawthorn yarn for this. If you're using a multicolored yarn, it can create a little bit of like a plaid in the weaving. Looks pretty cool. You can also just use solid yarn. You can also use a yarn that closely matches the color of the thing that you're weaving if you want it to be less visible. It's going to be visible, but it can be much more subtle by matching the color, of course. And you can even do kind of like shapes.
Yeah,
so
I was gonna.
It doesn't have to be a rectangle.
Mention that I saw around Valentine's Day, Katrinkles, who makes the mini loom we sell on our website. They had a tutorial on their Instagram on using the mini loom to make a little heart patch. It was so cute, and it made me actually be a little tempted by the visible mending techniques. I'm like, a little heart on my elbow would be really sweet.
Yeah, I've done kind of like circles and ovals a little bit, and just I've done like wonky rectangles that aren't really rectangles, or polygons or something, or rhombuses. I don't remember geometry. Is that the word I'm thinking of? Where the sides are not parallel with each other. That's easy to do. It's also easy to do accidentally, but you can do intentional shapes as well. Yeah. And then you can also do kind of like, if you have like a bigger, wonkier hole, or just like you want it to be more stable. Like if you have a hole, but then the area all around it has worn pretty thin, so it's not like the hole's not that big, but then the area around it gets bigger and you're afraid that's going to rip into a bigger hole, you can kind of weave around it through the actual fabric itself. So the only part that's like fully woven, like with the method I just talked about, is like where the hole is. But then the area around the hole, you're like kind of going up and down and up, and like running stitches like into the fabric itself, so that you're what's the word I'm looking for? You're making it stronger. You're strengthening that fabric. Reinforcing, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Yeah. So you're covering the hole and you're reinforcing the fabric around the hole so that new holes don't rip.
Yeah. That's
So
a very necessary step that I think sometimes gets missed when someone's new to mending. Like, I know I did this where I like fixed the hole, but I didn't really consider like this is a high wear area, and like if I might not be able to see that the yarn is thinning farther from the hole, but it probably is. It definitely is, because you'll end up with like
yeah.
a hole that's right next to your mend if you don't go out far enough around it in the surrounding area.
Yeah. So you can kind of decide if you know it's a high wear, if it's Andy's elbow or my heel or whatever that is for you. Either make the patch big enough to cover the whole area, really, or do some reinforcing around the patch, which, running stitches work really well, just kind of going in both directions, and that'll just make it stronger, keep it from ripping again.
So I've also seen where people have mended by like doing like embroidery over like pieces to like hide the hole. That's a term, right?
Yeah.
That's a type of mending, right?
Yeah. Embroidery can definitely be a type of mending. That's like I don't know why it's not trendier now, but like that's a very traditional way of mending things too. Like that's the original visible mending is embroidery.
Yeah, definitely embroidering, and also like applique, which if you're just doing a standard applique, it's just putting a patch over it. But you can also do reverse applique by, taking the hole, kind of folding the edges of the hole under, and then putting a patch behind it so it shows through in a very intentional way. These are all kind of embroidery, applique, reverse applique are all things that you can just do to fabric just because you want to. But you can also use them as ways to cover up holes, stains, anything else, thinning fabric. Definitely a fun, visible way that looks like very intentional, not really like a mend.
Yeah.
Sashiko. That's what I was trying to think of the name.
Well, sashiko is, so that would be a way of mending wovens more.
Oh, okay.
It's a very common way of visible mending on jeans. So you wouldn't really do that on knits.
You'd lose too much stretch.
Yeah, I guess so. I was just thinking, I'm like, oh, this little hole I have on my sweater, I could just like put some flowers on it and it's all fixed, right?
Yeah. So embroidery, like embroidering flowers, stuff like that would be a different thing than sashiko. But sashiko is actually more similar to the method I was talking about when I was saying doing running stitches like around the hole. With that, you would have a patch kind of behind the hole, and then you're doing running stitches, but like in a pattern. So you could do running stitches so they make little crosses. You can do running stitches so they make like stair step patterns, or all kinds of different patterns. We'll put links in the show notes to show you what we're talking about. But traditionally, it would be done commonly with white sashiko thread on like dark denim. So it's like a white on dark pattern, and you're kind of going through the fabric itself and then through the patch and the fabric layers and through the patch where the hole is, and you're kind of turning the patch and the hole and the fabric around it all into one more stabilized, reinforced, strong fabric that's gonna not rip.
Okay,
cover
that makes much more sense than what I was thinking.
And the sort of difference between using running stitch to stabilize and following the path of your stitches and doing something like sashiko is like, if you're not following the path of your stitches and you're doing a rigid woven stitching method, basically, you're going to lose a lot of stretch, which could put more stress on an already weak area. So that's why it's a better method for wovens than just boring old running stitch following the stitches.
Apparently I know less about mending than I realized. I'm just going to throw terms out. This is something I've heard and it's cute.
Well, this brings me to what I highly recommend for anyone who has a knitted group. It's like a great way to like just find out other people's preferred mending methods, and it's like the only way I motivate myself to mend things is a mending party with your knitting group. My old knitting group in Seattle did one. The last one we did was like in 2019. So most things I've damaged since then are still in the mending pile. But we just like haul all of our mending to somebody's house and sit and do it. And it's like a good, not only just like motivation to actually get it done, because it's not the most fun. Like it's always sad when you've damaged something you spent hours making, even though like you want to mend it and you're going to be happy with it once you mended it. There's like that little bit of sadness when you pull out a sweater you spent so many hours knitting and you see that hole. So like turning the mending into a fun event helps, at least for me. These might not be universal emotions, but
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I like the idea of, everyone like we both have totally different methods for sure. And a knit group is going to have, that many different people with that many different preferences and methods and experience and little random tips and tricks they've picked up and all sharing those with each other. So, yeah.
So, what would you guys say if I'm not saying I do, but what if I have a project that has a moth hole in it? What do you guys suggest for? I'm not saying I do, but just what would you suggest would be the best thing to mend? Best way to mend it.
I think it would depend on the moth hole size.
Yeah. It depends more on what the item is and it's a hand knit and what kind of weight gauge placement.
What if it's a worsted weight sweater that does not exist, does not have moth holes in it, but if it did?
Like, I like duplicate stitch for moth holes because they tend to be fairly, like clusters of small holes are what I've experienced with moth holes, and duplicate stitch is a good one for that because like you don't have like a wide area and you probably don't have like a ton of drop down stitches that need fixing. It's usually like a gap between one stitch. At least those are my moth hole experiences.
Yeah, that could possibly be the problem I have or don't have with my sweater.
And if you have like a cluster of small holes that are like distinct, like they don't like bleed into each other, but they're like small holes close by each other, you could make that a fun design feature by kind of stitching, like whip stitching with a contrasting yarn around the holes. Because then if there's a cluster of them, that would look like a nice little design feature that looks very intentional.
One thing we haven't talked about is using sort of steeking methods to just make the whole permanent design feature.
That sounds so scary.
Because like if you have like a big enough hole somewhere where like a cluster of holes would be cute, you could blanket stitch with crochet around them, which is how some people like to finish their steeks. You would use a finer gauge yarn and a smaller crochet hook, or not blanket stitch, slip stitch around the whole. You could also blanket stitch, which is a sewing stitch, but just finish the edge of the hole like you would a steek. And then maybe embroider some flower petals and make it a daisy, like.
Yeah.
That's my kind of mending.
Or there's another really cool method of like darning that works well for circles is this kind of blanket stitching like in a circle. I don't remember I should have looked up all the names for things before this, but I'll find it and link it in the show notes. But just kind of creating a sunburst kind of embroidered circle in the hole that goes out to the edges and is stitched around. And it's kind of like a blanket stitch-esque technique of, and you can also just crochet, like crochet mending is a common thing too. Like crocheting, like Andi was saying, like slip stitch crochet kind of around the hole, but you can also take that into the middle and close it in the middle. So it's not an actual hole anymore. Like how you would crochet like the top crown of a hat or something.
I've never thought of that.
Neat.
That's a good method.
I'm going to try that. on my next sweater.
Mending is a topic people need to discuss more because whenever I like have a mending party or like a conversation like we are on this episode, I'm always like, oh, that's a great idea. I've never thought of that. Like we talk so much about like other knitting techniques, but like there's just as many mending techniques.
Yeah, it's been around longer than knitting has, probably. I would imagine. Because like weaving has been around obviously much longer than knitting, and mending has been necessary ever since woven was invented, which was yeah. So I'm sure there are all kinds of techniques that none of us have ever even seen or heard of before. There's a lot of cool vintage antique mending tools. I have a friend who collects vintage darning mushrooms and darning looms. Actually, my darning loom is a vintage Russian darning loom.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it's because mending is so old. You can find old tools too.
That's neat.
Well, I think we could probably talk about mending for like literally hours because there's so many different paths we go down, especially if we had some more prompts or did a bit more research ahead on specific things. So if you, the listener, want to ask us specific questions about mending or say like, hey, have you heard of this technique? Can you talk about it? Or, ask us questions like Stacey's moth-eaten sweater, like, hey, I have this.
it may not exist.
Or, hypotheticals or whatever. If you have specific mending questions you want to ask us, we can definitely do like a follow-up mending segment in the future and have, more chit chat about mending because we are into that. I will always talk about mending. So yeah, drop questions in the blog post comments or the Instagram comments, or you are about to hear our voicemail instructions in the end segment. So we'll have a phone number for you there and you can call in and ask questions there. Yeah.
Please call us. We never get any calls. Call us.
Yeah. Yes. I'll end by saying happy Mending March. Everybody bend. This podcast was originally created by Kelly Petkin.
It is produced and hosted by me, Stacey Winklepleck, and Lee Meredith.
It's produced by Andy Satterland with additional production and editing by Chase Ryan.
We recorded this episode in the Pacific Northwest where we're wearing our sweaters to death.
From everyone here at Nitpicks, thank you for joining us.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual participants. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions or views of the Crafts Group LLC or Premier Needle Arts.
All the yarn, tools, and patterns mentioned in this episode, along with all the inspiration an knitter could need, can be found at our website, knitpicks.com.
If you'd like to be on our podcast, leave us a voicemail. We'll be checking it regularly and using your calls in later episodes. To leave a voicemail, call 360-334-4847 and record your message. You can also record a voice memo on your phone and email us that audio file at podcasts@knitpicks.com.
Like and follow us on your favorite social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube at Nitpicks.
Rate and review us wherever you listen to this podcast.
Until next time, happy crafting!